I want to jump into the internal pressure as well as the outside pressure, right? To get this thing correct. There's been a lot of that lately, whether it be a guy like Joe Burrow jumping on various shows, talking about how he wants to keep guys together and all this kind of stuff like that. I think it's a really cool thing, right? Because I think that it's the one offseason where you can't be like, well, you're just relying strictly on outside media. You're getting pressure legitimately from your leader. Joe Burrow, I think he realized this now. You think about it. Hey, I have more power than I realize, right? It's not like it's the Palmer days and all that kind of stuff like that. You actually did take this team to a Super Bowl with a lackluster offensive line. This is I could almost will say that if I can compare the Joe Burrow impact to any player in the sports world, I hope I'm not selling him short here when I say this, but I think his impact in Cincinnati and Ohio is very similar to what Luka's might have been with Dallas Mavericks or was with the Dallas Mavericks, right? So they wanted to see the Mavericks organization do right by Luka Doncic, right? And I think that Bengals fans alike are wanting to see the Bengals organization do right by Joe Burrow, and they're saying, hey, you know what? Joe's speaking out, right? And you felt like it was this weird cluster where people felt like they couldn't criticize or say what they wanted to say. But when Joe Burrow said it, everybody speaks out in droves now. And now you got guys like Trey Hendrickson who, talked about the communication aspect or the lack of it, if you will, on the Pat McAfee show and how he came to, hear from Duke Tobin's comments made at the Senior Bowl. It's one of those things where it's not like it's the early 2000s anymore, the mid 2000s anymore. Social media is very alive and well, right? There are so many different shows out there. Guys have to answer some tough questions at times, and the organization is going to be hit with some of those tough questions. If you got Joe Burrow doing a media tour, and I'll be honest with you, seeing the guy walking around Radio Row, he looked miserable doing it. If you've heard the stories about Joe Burrow hating media, all that stuff is real. The fact of the matter is, Joe Burrow's coming out saying, hey, we need to keep these guys. Hey, we need to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to make sure we keep our star players. And I think that there's something to be said about the Bengals keeping players that actually want to be here. Hearing Trey Hendrickson come out and say, hey, I want to help Cincinnati win a championship, whether that means you trade me and you get draft capital or we agree to an extension. I want to see Cincinnati win a championship. Those are guys that you want to see here. Like Jesse Bates was one of those guys, right? Obviously, you couldn't work with his agent Dave Mulgeta because it was just a rough negotiation all around, and burnt bridges might have happened there. But when you look at it, man, it really comes down to the Bengals got to do a better job of making sure that they keep the players that want to be here in stripes. Not only that, but the players that are actually performing at a high level. And I think that's the conversation. I think that's what couldn't get lost in some things. So those are my thoughts. But I want to talk about the internal pressure. I want to talk about the push to keep guys, the push to build a competitive and championship level roster. Daniel, let's start with you.
I think that this is a huge offseason for the Bengals. And I think a lot of it has to do with this is a huge part of your window, because when you look at the actual cap, like we talked about, Jamar Chase isn't getting paid a shit ton of money this offseason. Tee Higgins, even for his franchise tag, isn't getting paid, a $30 million tag. Same thing with, Joe Burrow, is that it's such a huge part of your franchise building that, in my opinion, you have to go out there and you have to sign these guys. And I think that this is the offseason where you could really mess things up, if we're being honest, right? You look at the past two off seasons, and the free agency misses this past offseason came back to bite the team in the ass. But you have to look 1 year in advance, 2 years in advance. And like I said, I think that this is such a huge part of the franchise that we were even talking before this offseason, where, hey, there was a chance that we were saying, should Zach Taylor be fired, right? You didn't make the playoffs with Joe Burrow having one of the best seasons we've ever seen from a quarterback. Same thing with Jamar Chase. You're in this window that is so prime for a franchise, and the NFL is different than other sports. The NFL really is short windows at times. It is very rare that we see teams like the New England Patriots or teams like the Kansas City Chiefs continuously make it to the AFC Championship, continuously make it. And the Bengals have a chance to do that now. So I hope that they feel the pressure. And it really comes down to just retaining what you have right now. I don't think that anybody's asking for them to go out and trade for Myles Garrett. I don't think anybody's asking for them to go out and trade up in the first round or, make a massive move. It really is just plug some of these holes, right? The interior offensive line, plug some of the holes, maybe go out there and spend on the interior defensive line. But what is being asked of the Cincinnati Bengals team is not anything that's out of the realm of possibility. You're not asking like these other teams, can you trade for a franchise quarterback? You have a franchise quarterback, you have a star wide receiver, and you have a roster that has a base that you can work with. So I like I said, I hope that they feel the pressure and the on the Tee Higgins front too. Tee Higgins should not, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that he would play on the franchise tag this, for back-to-back seasons. So I just look at it and I think that this team has some questions to be answered. I think that Tee Higgins is the number one question because Trey Hendrickson, we can talk about it, but Tee Higgins is the number one question. Do you re-sign him long term and then go on from there?
Yeah,
So
I think in general, I don't think the internal pressure can get much higher. I think everybody, I don't want to say they're about to all lose their jobs because we know that's not necessarily the case, but a lot of people, if things go south, will not be there. And then the following year, and, go to the Super Bowl, go to the AFC Championship game, injuries. We cut him some slack with the injury with Joe, missed the playoffs. Okay. There's some reasonable expectations of why we missed the playoffs. It's a clear, this is what happened. This is why we didn't make the playoffs. Maybe we could have snuck in, whatever. But then you go into this year and, it was one of the most unique years ever. You have a dominant offense. You have the youngest Triple Crown winner ever. You have a quarterback playing out of his mind. You just have an offense scoring a shit ton of points. You have one of the worst defenses in the league, one of the worst defenses ever, but you also somehow have the sack leader at the same time. It was just such a unique year. And it's very hard to kind of look at it and be like, man, we just sucked for whatever reason. Nothing was right. And that's not a feeling you could have. And that's one of the most dangerous positions to be in is like, we don't necessarily know why these things didn't work. We don't really know why these players didn't work. We don't really know why we kept losing games, but we just kept losing games. So just that alone, it applies so much pressure when you don't have the obvious answers. And now you got to try to figure them out yourself. And how are we going to fix that? Maybe you're fixing the completely wrong thing. That's really not winning the game. Maybe Zach Taylor is the reason. Not saying he is, but I'm just saying maybe they look at the roster when in reality it's the coach. They look at the coach when it's the roster, vice versa, all those things. When there's no clear answer, things get dangerous. And that's why I think the pressure is so high. Because again, the defense was terrible, but you have somebody who was the best defensive player in the league last year.
Mm-hmm.
You have an offense that was so great, but still couldn't be good enough to win games somehow. So when you have all these things going for you and there's no obvious pathway to get back to the Super Bowl, to get back to these things that you want to be, that's where it gets scary. That's where the pressure is going to build from yourself. It's already building the media. It's already building with the players. But now when you're looking at your product that you have, and it's like, man, do we do this? Do we do that? You start to second guess. You start to overthink. You start to question. You start to do these things. And that's kind of how the pressure is building internally, even through the draft process. We don't know what they're going to do in the first round. We don't know how they're going to attack free agency. We don't know. And I think that is just a clear signal that you can kind of feel the pressure within the building.
Yeah, man. I think you guys have pretty much said it all. The internal pressure is all that's left. You've gotten rid of everybody else, right?
Yeah.
There's no one else left to blame if things don't work out because it's clearly not Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, right?
Yeah.
It's clearly not Trey Hendrickson, right? So that there's only the coaching staff and the front office, and you can't blame the coaching staff necessarily for all the draft misses. Yeah, there's been struggles to develop talent, but there's also been some poor draft picks along the way, and I don't think the coaching staff owns all of that responsibility. I think that there needs to be some serious changes to coaching staff and front office, particularly with approach and evaluation and also valuation. Not just how good is somebody, but how do we value these positions in the modern NFL? How do we invest in the modern NFL in terms of contracts? Because we know they're willing to pay things like quarterback, tackle, wide receiver, right? Do they need to adjust how they approach contracts? We think yes. Like these are all every bit of this process needs to be reevaluated because you can't continue to cling to an old school approach in a world that is so rapidly changing in so many ways, especially the NFL contract structure, everything that's happening right now with technology and all the different financial mechanisms that are out there now for maneuvering contracts. They have a lot of tools at the disposal. And as much as they love their ham radio, you've got iPhones and you got a bunch of different technology now that you can use. And it's time to learn how to use all these tools because they can make your life a lot better.
There's definitely going to be some conversations that need to be had.